Daniel Diemers studied virtual communities for his PhD in the dial-up.com days of the 1990s. Now, as a fintech strategy consultant, he advises some of the world's biggest corporations on policy issues around Bitcoin and blockchain. Daniel spoke at CoinGeek's London conference in February. It was a chance to combine his community's interest, meeting the Bitcoin SV crowd for the first time, with his blockchain expertise, where he's focusing on moving real-world applications on-chain. I wanted to hear Dr. Diemers' take on the behaviour of real and digital communities and how BSV should sell itself to big business.
You're listening to CoinGeek Conversations with Charles Miller.
So Daniel, thank you very much for doing CoinGeek Conversations.
Thank you for having me.
Before we get to the world of Bitcoin SV, dive back into your own history a little bit, because your early involvement with technology and communities, with virtual communities, and you were studying that academically.
Yes, so I started in the 80s in 8-bit computing. So I was a coder in the Commodore, 64 times. And these were already virtual communities because you were interacting through servers internationally with other people. I then tried out online multi-player like games that came before the internet was what we know it with HTML, etc. And then I started looking at this academically. So I wanted to research how do virtual communities constitute themselves, how are the dynamics, and how do you develop trust. And when I did a PhD on that, I actually found corporate sponsors or corporations that were also interested in that topic. For example, they rolled out knowledge management systems and they found that people from, let's say, Japan, Switzerland and America, they don't interact with each other as much as they like because, for example, the virtual community was not embedded enough. And so I really researched that. It was a big passion of mine.
Looking at the parallels between that and where we are today you're a strategy consultant working with big financial companies. Is there a parallel in terms of there's some weird stuff going on with this Bitcoin thing, whatever that may be, and big companies feel that they need to understand it and make sure they don't miss out on something?
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating thing about the blockchain ecosystem, so to say. I mean, there's a lot of communities. They constitute almost like tribes. They interact with each other. And at the same time, corporates are a bit at the loss, right? They're looking at this. It develops next to them. And they wonder, what is all this happening here around them? At the same time, of course, digitalization for corporations is quite a complex thing. It's, of course, not just blockchain. At the same time, they're looking at AI, they're looking at other technologies depending on the industry, drones or robots or AR, VR, augmented reality, virtual reality. So it's actually it's quite a task, right? So in the boardrooms today, the heat is rising because the exponential technologies are just coming with a full force and it's getting rather faster than slower.
So going back to the virtual communities and the corporate interest in that, would it be unfair to say that didn't really go anywhere?
Yeah, that's true. I mean, that was, if you remember, this whole knowledge management lore and narrative that was very strong in the 90s, where basically companies said, well, we need to externalize all our knowledge into virtual communities, into databases, and have people basically interact virtually with that. They felt and had to learn that the human element, friendships, relationships, people knowing each other from seeing themselves, maybe having a drink together or sharing a dinner, they still matter and they matter in the corporate world still today, obviously. So I think that was a learning thing that we all went through in the first .com, you could say, craze or hype when the bubble also burst. We all thought back then everything is going to turn totally digital and we'll all be interacting in virtual communities alone. But the reality check came, but today again we're a bit back at this narrative and we're back at the discussions, and I think blockchain is a good example.
But even before we leave the community thing, today we have Slack, for instance.
True.
Which may be more what people might have had in mind for those virtual communities.
True. Yeah, like interaction platforms where you can, productively work. Because don't forget, the early virtual communities, they were all very playful. They were circled around the IRC chats, for example. You were just exchanging opinions on a subject. In my research, I looked at support groups of people who had very rare diseases, for example. Mm-hmm. If you're living in the middle of nowhere in a country and you don't know people around you who have that disease, you're pretty lonely. And suddenly there were virtual communities globally where people who had the same disease suddenly shared experiences, how did that medicament works, treatment, etc. And beyond the knowledge exchange, also provided support, emotional support. It's always nice to connect with people who share the same interest or like you. So these were all very interesting developments, and I think it's for me an intrinsic part of the digital age that it's not just computers and bits and bytes, and it's also humans, and how do we humans interact in that new world. And that brings us straight into the whole blockchain thing, right? This has been developed and now it's growing and growing and growing, and of course now it touches the borders of the large corporates.
Yes.
And they're looking at this and they see it's a different language, it's different values, it's different discussions going on than what they're used to. So this is where the interesting intersection now happens.
So now, in your position as a consultant, if you're invited to talk to people in these boardrooms, are you trying to persuade them that there are opportunities for them here, or are you trying to warn them about not getting sucked into the hype of it all, or what's the conversation like?
Actually, it's a bit of both, right? So first of all, there's always an educational element. People in boardrooms, they have other tasks and duties, so they can't be, by definition, blockchain experts. I'm also trying to cut a bit through the whole hype thing. So whatever time, maybe there's a hype here, or there was a bad news in the newspaper about some hackers who, appropriated coins. I try to damp that down and say, no, ignore all the things you're hearing, ignore all these Silk Road stories. That was in the past. We're going into the future. So there's also some element of toning it down.
Yeah, so there's some negative preconceptions.
Of course. You read the same newspapers that they read, and you will occasionally bump into these stories, and then they talk to 3 friends who are a bit at the same level like they are, so they will probably hang up on topics like criminals and fraud. So that this has been riddling our industry now for the past years. It's no secret. At the same time, as a strategy consultant, when I work with clients, I always look at opportunities. I look at growth. I want to be kind of a positive, with a positive outlook. So I show them the opportunities, but not really trying to be missionary and say you have to go into this in the next 6 months or you're out of business. But I try to take a fair and square look at it, saying these are the opportunities. You can either wait or you can dive in now and give them the options, and then at the end it's going to be also their decisions what to do with it.
And so looking at those opportunities, what do you feel is in a way the easiest sell? What kind of thing are you most confident about persuading somebody is going to be useful for them?
This is hard. This is a hard question. This is a really hard question because actually what I want to sell is probably the thing hardest to sell. So what I want to sell them is actually, big solutions. Obviously it doesn't make sense if in the logistics space, every logistics company pursues their own little logistics project. And then sometimes they huddle together and you find little consortia of 4 or 5. That's good, but it's still not solving the problem that basically we probably will need a global solution for logistics on chain that somehow moves, let's say, containers around, that's connected to the warehouses, that the customs authorities can access to do whatever the customs authorities have to do, and all these things. And I think this is where the bold visions are the hardest sell, because of course in the boardroom you paint a picture like that, they're going to say, yeah, but these are the 5 reasons why we're not going to look at this right now.
You need to give them something they can take a kind of baby step with.
Sell it in chunks, right? Or go in it with audible chunks. And this is a bit where the industry is stuck right now, right? All the companies are talking probably to people like me, and they're selling them small bites and small chunks. Hence, they all do the pilots and POCs. And I see a risk in that is that most pilots, they're not that spectacular, right?
Right.
Because if you don't pursue the big vision, but you go after a very small little tiny use case, then they jump on a permission blockchain for that because they don't see the benefit of doing this on a large scalable one. And then they do the pilot and it gets reported back into the boardroom. Someone comes up and presents, okay, this is the pilot. And of course, results can't be that spectacular.
because it's just a limited
just a little
thing.
pilot.
Yeah.
You're not swimming out in the ocean. You're just dipping in the hotel pool and waddling around, and that's not just the real thing. So this is the really hard sell. I mean, I always try to give them a long-term vision. How does the logistics space evolve? Financial services, or in the IoT world, self-autonomous cars. I was just mentioning that in the panel. In a world in 10, 15 years, when in London all cars will be self-driving, steered by AIs that constantly communicate with each other, and we humans, we just sit in there and do whatever we like to do with our additional free time. How will all these autonomous cars interact with each other? Both they will exchange communications like, hey, can you move by? I want to pass, or there's an accident down the road. Everyone careful. At the same time, they'll do microtransactions, right? They're going to pay for things. They're going to pay for electricity, maybe toll gates, waiting at the red light. Maybe they can pay that the red light turns green sooner.
So you see that all a blockchain-based technology?
It has to be, right? I mean, imagine just the city of London, if all cars are moving in sync on AIs, how do you do all these microtransactions? How do they communicate with each other? If there's going to be a master database sitting here somewhere in the city, I mean, that's recipe for disaster, right? The database goes down, hackers can penetrate it, so then probably will be a large scalable microtransaction enabled blockchain required, and this is probably where of course BSV comes in. But to get there, that is a big step, because you need to convince the car makers, the road toll, the government, the City of London, responsible for the traffic lights. It's, the ecosystem needs to be complete, and to build that, that's a very bold vision.
I mean, I think it's very interesting the way you're describing this, because I mean, I've heard the cynical view that consultants love the idea of blockchain because they've got something to sell to their clients that the clients don't really understand. But what you're saying is that there is this problem between demonstrating something that perhaps doesn't seem that spectacular because it's limited in scale, and then this sort of wonderful utopian view of how the world will change when everybody is using blockchain. And then the problem is, how do we get to that point? Because even if everyone agrees it would be great if we were there, how do we get from here to there?
Absolutely, because I've been now quite a few years in blockchain, and because I already know that the pilots will, in many cases, not be that spectacular, why would I try sell a small little contained pilot where I know that 6 months down the road I'm going to be at a board meeting and everyone's going to go like, hey, Daniel, that's not as terrific as you promised us, right? So
the question is, what is your strategy as a strategist?
My strategy is to be bold, to be unafraid, but also to spell exactly that out. I say you can fiddle around with pilots and POCs. There's a lot of corporates who have done 20, 30 of POCs, and they keep their teams busy.
They're expensive.
And they're expensive in their own right. So I try to move them a bit more into the bold vision model and say, well, let's rather think about some bold vision. Maybe it's hard to attain. Maybe you'll need to talk to your competitors. Maybe you need to go to the government and to these counterparties. But I think that's then something that you can wrap your brain around.
So is the bold vision a public blockchain vision?
I mean, in the example of autonomous cars in an IoT world driving around London or the world, I don't really think permission blockchain will, who will control it? Is it a permission blockchain by the car builders or by the City of London or by whom? So, I think that is a good argument why it should be a public one, so that all the different participants can plug in, right? It needs to be, in a way, a neutral one, and that is the feature of public ones, rather than built by individual companies.
So that all points towards Bitcoin SV.
Well, that's definitely a strong competitor, but I'm not that deep in the protocol to really say, well, that is the solution. There are many competing protocols, as you know, and I was referring in my discussion that the ecosystem is very important to make a decision. So just the technical features will not lead the final decision of a board to go for that technology or that technology. Usually they would delegate that to their CTO anyway and tell him or her, you decide which company we use.
But it's interesting because if it's not the technical features, then it's perhaps the reputation of the people behind it and who's backing it and stuff. Whereas the whole point of something like Bitcoin SV is that there isn't a sort of owner to meet and to shake the hand of.
True, but I have a very clear view here that something that is completely decentralized and anonymous and there's no one backing it, corporates don't like that, right? Because they want to know there's a steward of the protocol, or there's mechanism built, or there's companies like Enchain where I can go and I find qualified people that can help me with something. If there's no one taking care of it, I mean, it doesn't sound that appealing. This is why Hyperledger and protocols like that are very appealing to large corporates, because they're associated with big brands they already know. They know a lot of other corporates are going down that route, so it is a bit this herd effect. They say, okay, we do the same what others are doing.
Nobody got fired for choosing IBM.
Exactly. This is the narrative here. But I think in a panel we discussed there's the governance, so they want to know who is kind of behind it, who is in charge. Is this a credible story? Do I have to worry that 2 years down the road the protocol is going to be completely reinvented and moved from one model to the other? These are all things corporates don't like. They also want to know, is this thing regulatorily appropriate? Will my regulators give me any hard time if I choose like this blockchain over that blockchain? So there's also this regulatory side, legal side, and then they want to see how big is the ecosystem. I think this is also very important, and that's something where BSV has to grow. I mean, if a CEO decides in a pharmaceutical company, all right, let's go with BSV, and then he tells his CTO, hire 5 world-class developers now, or you have 2 months. And then if these people are not on the market, that's a problem, right? I mean, I'm do a lot with work with banks. There's a lot of core banking systems out there in the markets. Sometimes core banking systems gets chosen on the precondition that there's a large crowd of developers and integrators available for that core banking system.
It's a chicken and egg situation, though, isn't it? Because those developers with experience are not going to exist unless those jobs are there to be had.
True, yeah. But often that's a decision criteria. So not just the technology, but can we hire not just a consulting company or an IT company, because they're going to come and go away. Maybe we want to build those capabilities. That's what I would tell them as a strategy consultant. I would say, don't just rely on external parties. Try to build some capabilities in-house. Have a group be very savvy, hire some certified, if there's a certification, even better, and build those capabilities up. If the market is not there, again, that's a minus, right? They'll say, but if we can't find anyone who wants to work for us on that, we're going to be reliant always on some consultants coming in and doing the work for us, the plumbing. So I think it's a complex mix of criteria, the governance, also of course features for money. So how expensive is that? I think this is where also semantics maybe need to change. If you come to me and you say, well, choose BSV because it got unlimited block size, we can do whatever we want. As a corporate, you hear unlimited, it immediately means, costs probably high and probably too big for what I need it for, right? So a better sell is probably to say, we are very flexible, we can accommodate any size requirement that you want. So whatever you need, we can solve it, because we are scalable. But just saying it's unlimited in a corporate mindset, unlimited is always, that's not right. That's not economical.
If I were to ask you to give a kind of school report on how you think the young Bitcoin SV is growing up, what would your assessment be? Well,
I've been on many blockchain conferences the past years, and I'm really impressed by this conference. It's very professionally organized, but more importantly, I think the people I meet is quite an interesting crowd, because I see a lot of use case applications. So already startups that have built something that are out there. I spoke to a group. They're building a core banking system on BSV. I think that's very bold and a very interesting perspective, because there's going to be a big need for core banking replacements. There was an interesting, I think, Chronoverse, in the e-gaming industry, where of course cheating and cheaters is becoming more and more critical. And I think the trust layer that a blockchain can provide will be very important here. So I see a lot of interest in, and I have great talks in the breaks. I think the breaks could be a bit longer because it's a great interaction. I'm very, very happy to be here. But as you say, I'm outside of the circle, so I'm still learning, right? I'm diving into it and learning about the people and the protocol.
But you're going to leave here, and the people you interact with in your consultancy work, you're going to be potentially saying BSV is an interesting area to be looking at.
Definitely, yeah, no, definitely. I mean, the features of the protocol, I think they point absolutely in the direction that I'm think is going to be important. Large applitions, not small. Also the reliability of the protocol is very important. And of course, the ecosystem needs to grow. So it's time to build, but at the same time, I think that's the motto of this conference. It's also time to grow and also time to engage with corporates. I think it would be a bad strategy for the BSV community to just now go down, let's build a lot of different apps and dApps and tools and then hope that corporates will discover it on their own. I think corporates don't operate like that. They're not going to scout you have to engage them. You have to go to them and say, look, what are your 3 biggest problems that we can help you solve? We got the technology, we got the builders for it, we can co-create, we work together with your IT people and there's knowledge transfer happening. That's the strategy I would pursue to really engage early because there's also a time clock ticking here. I see now all corporates dipping their feet in the pool, doing pilots here and there. Some have already built quite sizable blockchain teams up. And if you now wait too long, let's say 2-3 years before you do the big marketing and go to market and rollout, it may happen that on many requests to corporates, they'll say, oh, thank you, but we're already built on this or on that platform. Yeah. It's already done. I have a team of coders here and I don't need another one. So I think there's a timing issue here. And my advice outside in would be to also go and engage companies very early on, even if maybe not all the apps and dApps are ready and maybe not all solutions are here, but co-create them because by engaging with large corporates particularly, you will also see, where can you help the most. Yeah.
That's terrific. Well, I hope you come back to the next conference as well. And
if I get invited, I'll be happy to.
It'll be bigger and better than ever before. So thank you very much.
Thanks for having me. Thanks.
Thank you.
My thanks to Daniel Diemers. And we had no idea when that conversation was recorded back in February just how relevant virtual communities were about to become. I hope everyone is keeping well. Please join me again next week for another CoinGeek Conversation.